Okay, so this is the second in a series of videos about the physiology of pain. So if you haven't watched the first video, please start with that one because what we're going to discuss now is going to make a lot more sense if you start with that first video. And in that first video, we talked about the fact that thinking about pain the way that most people do as just a simple alarm system that sounds a siren when there's some sort of an emergency leads, number one, to a lot of unnecessary fear, and number two is not based on our most current scientific understanding of how pain works. We concluded the last video talking about how pain is not an accurate measure of tissue health. And I gave you a number of examples of that. Examples of situations where there's severe tissue injury and no pain or very little pain. And then on the other hand, lots of examples where there's minor injury to tissues and severe pain, or even the most compelling example of all where there's no tissue injury at all, where there's actual limb amputation and a person still experiences severe pain in that phantom limb. So we concluded that last video by saying pain is not an accurate measure of tissue health. And so if tissue health isn't the determining factor of whether or not we have pain, what is that factor? And that is going to be the topic of this second video. Now, Dr. Lorimer Moseley is an Australian pain scientist who is really incredibly effective at explaining some very complex physiological concepts in a way that's really simple and easy to understand. He has a TED Talk and a number of other videos available on YouTube, and so if you're interested in exploring this further, I would definitely recommend that you look up his name and check into what he has to say. But one quote from Dr. Moseley is that you will have pain when your brain concludes that there is more credible evidence of danger related to your body than there is credible evidence of safety related to your body. Okay, so that's what we're going to explore, and the implications of this concept is what we are going to explore in this video. So the brain actually works like, you've probably heard this idea that your brain is like a supercomputer. And the implication of this when it comes to pain is that at every moment, every second of every day, your brain is constantly in the process of monitoring, receiving millions and millions and millions of bits of data that are streaming into the brain from both the internal environment, so from our body would be your internal environment, and from your external environment, so your surroundings. Billions and billions of bits of data streaming in at any given moment, and then the brain is processing that data in the context of information that's stored in memory and weighing evidence of threat against evidence of security in order to arrive at an opinion about whether or not pain is a necessary or an appropriate response. And so this is a very complicated process. It's also a process, as I mentioned in the last video, in which the brain plays an extremely active role. And so the way that I think about this, when I read that quote from Dr. Moseley a few years ago, it made me think about a balance beam scale that looked like this, that I used in the laboratory in my high school, and the way that scale balances or weighs weights on either side. And so that then led me to kind of start thinking about pain in this way. Although this process is very complicated, for the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to simplify it like this. So moment to moment, so you've got this scale, and from moment to moment, there's weights that are being placed on the evidence of security and the evidence of threat sides of the scale. And then the brain is determining based on factors like your beliefs, your emotions, your memories. It's determining how big those weights are, number one, and whether or not they belong on the threat or the security side of the scale, number two. So this, we all understand that the same set of circumstances or the same experience can be perceived as a happy or pleasant one or a very threatening one, depending on a person's point of view. And so like one example of this would be the experience of being in a hospital. For one person, being in a hospital might make them feel very safe and secure and taken care of. And so therefore would go on the evidence of security side of the scale. And then for another person, being in a hospital could be an absolutely terrifying experience that feels very, very threatening. And so for that person, the experience of being in the hospital would go on the evidence of threat side of the scale. So does that make sense? How our beliefs, our emotions, our memories are determining, number one, how big the weights are, and number two, which pan of the scale the weights go on. And so my goal with this material and with future material that I'm going to be posting on this channel and on my website is to help you understand where these weights are being placed on your scale, and then further to control where those weights are being placed onto your scale, because it's the presence of those weights that determines whether or not your brain decides that pain is an appropriate or necessary response and therefore creates the sensory experience of pain. So you can see on this scale that if there's weights on the pain or the threat side of the scale, then that the dial is, or the needle on the dial or the meter is going to tip over into the pain area. And so on the other hand, if that evidence of threat is outweighed by more evidence of security, then that needle is going to tip over into the no pain side of the scale. And so my goal is to help you to understand how this is happening on a moment-to-moment basis, and further to actually exercise some control over where the weights are being placed on your scale. So going back to the same image that we discussed in the first video of the broken leg, so it's obvious in a situation like this that the evidence of threat that would go on the scale is coming from tissue damage. Now, the tissue damage in this x-ray is very severe, and so we would expect that would mean there would be a very large weight being placed on the evidence of threat side of the scale. And so that it would look like this. So you've got this damaged tissue on this side of the scale, and that would tip the needle over into the pain area. That makes sense to all of us. That is an experience that all of us have had, and that is an example of the pain system working exactly the way that it's supposed to work. But the body has an amazing capacity to heal. And so here is a diagram that shows pain over the course of time after there's an injury, like that broken leg. So down there at the bottom in red where it says injury, then there's this immediate steep rise in the amount of pain that the person's experiencing. And then there's a process of inflammation, scarring, remodeling, like the healing process takes place. And then if things work the way that they're supposed to, then that pain level goes down until it reaches baseline, until the person that has no more pain. So the tissue injury heals, the broken leg is taken care of, and there's no more pain. And so this is a system working the way that it's supposed to work. And so this is what the whole relationship looks like when there is a a relationship between tissue condition and pain. So when the tissue's in bad shape, when the leg is still broken, then there's a high level of pain. And then as that injury heals, then the level of pain goes down back to baseline, back to zero, and everything's working the way that it's supposed to work. But we all know that that is often not the case, because many people who have chronic pain have experienced firsthand, I've experienced firsthand, that sometimes you have that initial injury with that initial inflammation and scarring and remodeling and that type of thing. But then rather than pain levels going back down to baseline as healing takes place, that pain remains at a high level, and it can do that indefinitely. You know, I was in a car accident in 2003 and then went on to have over 10 years of severe chronic pain, even though that initial injury had healed. And so there has to be something else to explain why in some cases this is what happens and we don't get back down to that baseline even though tissue healing has taken place. And so the question is, so when pain persists past the point where tissue healing has taken place, something else is going on. And what is that something else? Well, there are a couple of things that could happen, and actually most of the time it's a combination of these factors. So number one, the brain has gotten better at producing pain. So the way I think about it is that the brain is like this orchestra. You know, any sensation that we experience or task that we perform involves the cooperative activity of various parts of the brain. And so just like a piece of music involves the cooperative effort of many musicians when it's being played by an orchestra. And so a normal, healthy brain is capable of playing thousands of different tunes. It's capable of playing a pain tune, but it's also capable of playing tunes related to being physically active, of experiencing physical pleasure, of focusing, of learning, that a normal brain is capable of interacting with itself in many different ways. But what can happen in a brain that is experiencing pain over a long period of time is that those musicians, so to speak, start playing the pain tune over and over and over again. And so the brain areas involved in receiving that information from those nociceptors, that starts the process. But then those brain areas that are receiving this nociceptive input from the body initially start playing that pain tune. And then it gets to the point where it becomes, those brain areas become really good at playing the pain tune because they're playing it over and over and over again. And so this is just the same way as anything that we do repeatedly actually sort of imprints itself on the brain and imprints itself on the nervous system until it becomes automatic. And so this includes all kinds of things that were initially sort of difficult for the nervous system to process in a coordinated way that eventually become automatic and effortless. And so this would include things like walking, or using a pencil or a pen to write, or typing on a keyboard, or any type of athletic activity like, you know, riding a bike or throwing a ball or driving a stick shift car, things like that. So those are all these complicated activities that eventually imprint themselves on the brain and become effortless and automatic. And unfortunately, the experience of pain can imprint itself on the brain in a very similar way. And so this happens because neurons, or nerve cells that fire together in sequence over and over and over again, eventually link up in these complex networks in the brain. And these networks make it possible for us, for instance, to walk without deliberately thinking, like lift your right leg and swing it forward and put your right heel down and roll forward and then lift your left leg. None of us have to do that. if we have normal nervous systems. And that's because the nerves involved in that complex activity have fired together many, many times and formed these very sturdy and complex networks in the brain. And so these networks, once they're established, are actually permanent in the brain, even if they're unused. And so this is the reason why, even if you're rusty, even if you haven't done it for 30 years, you never, for example, forget to ride a bike, or you never forget to how to drive a manual transmission car. And so the experience of pain also involves neural networks. And so when pain persists for more than a few months, several things happen. Number one, brain activity shifts from one part of the brain or one area of the brain to another. And so brain activity shifts from areas of the brain that are more involved with a perception of sensation from the body to areas of the brain that are more involved in emotion and memory. Number two, more nerve cells or neurons are actually recruited into these pain neural networks. And then pain is actually memorized by the brain as these neural networks fire together over and over and over again. And then we start to bring in other factors, things like insomnia, anxiety, anger. These experiences that often accompany pain actually amplify these neural networks and make them stronger as well. And so that heightens the perception of pain as well. And so basically what's happening is that the nervous system has become overprotective. It's become very, very, very sensitive to perceiving this evidence of threat. And then the suffering parts of the brain are becoming amplified in their activity. And the parts of the brain that would normally serve to filter out these suffering kinds of experiences are no longer working the way that they should be. And so then the result of that altogether is pain that persists and pain that gets bigger over time. And so this would be like, going back to that analogy of the burglar alarm system, this would be like, say you had a burglar alarm system that initially, when it was first installed, only sounded the siren if somebody broke a window or opened a door, or if there was a fire in your basement. But then over time, this system changed and got much more sensitive. So all of a sudden it got to the point where if there was a gentle breeze blowing a leaf across your driveway, that then the siren would sound. And so that's what's happening in a brain in chronic pain. And so back to the analogy of the orchestra. So this brain in chronic pain is playing the pain tune over and over and over and over and over and over again until it gets to the point where it forgets how to play lots of other tunes, the tunes associated with a pain-free experience of the body, the tunes associated with the experience of pleasure in the body. And that is why chronic pain tends to cause people suffering that just affects every aspect of their life. And so the way that this would actually look on this meter or on this scale diagram is that you see here how the colored area inside the brain, that pain area has gotten bigger. And so what's actually happened is that even when all factors being equal, even if there isn't more evidence of threat on the scale than there is evidence of security, then the brain still perceives pain in this situation. And then the second thing that can happen is that the brain is actually weighing something other than damaged tissue as evidence of threat. And so, going back to the idea that your brain will make pain when it concludes that you are in danger and you need to do something about it. So sometimes that danger comes from tissue injury in the body, but lots of times it comes from other places. So damage to the tissue is not the only thing that can cause your brain to reach the conclusion that you're in danger and that you need to do something about it. So factors that could cause your brain to reach that conclusion would be obviously the condition of tissue, you know, that's number one, but information that's stored in your memory, your thoughts and your emotions, your beliefs about yourself, about your life, about your body, your interpretation of your pain, what you think it means, what you're anticipating from the future as far as your pain is concerned, things that are going on in your external environment. So whether or not your home environment or your work environment feels safe or secure or pleasant or not, whether or not your relationships feel safe or not, and then also things like what you know and understand. Part of the reason why learning about pain physiology is so therapeutic is when you understand this whole process, pain doesn't have to continue to feel. Your belief about pain no longer is quite as threatening. Some of the fear associated with the pain goes away, and so it is no longer weighed as such a huge weight on the evidence of threat side of the scale. And so here is the meter with the emotions, beliefs, narrative, meaning like the story that you're telling about your life, the story that you're telling about your pain, lack of understanding, maybe if you continue to think of pain as like that burglar alarm system, and so every time you had pain, it caused you to reach the conclusion that something really catastrophic was wrong with your body, that would be a big weight on the evidence of threat side of the scale, and that would tip the needle into the pain part of the meter. And so if pain persists, we know that evidence of threat is coming from somewhere else. So if pain persists past the point when tissue healing has taken place, we know that that evidence of threat is coming from someplace other than the body. It's coming from the environment. So this could be sensory information, the news, your relationships. It could be coming from your beliefs about your body, about your health, about your condition. It could be coming from this personal narrative. It could come from your emotions. So this would include your conscious emotions, emotions that you're aware of having, but actually unconscious emotions or repressed emotions are very, very strong, are very heavy weights on the evidence of threat side of the scale, particularly when those repressed emotions conflict fundamentally with your sense of self or the way that you define yourself, the person that you want to be. Then those emotions become very heavy weights on the evidence of threat side of the scale. And so again, future video, we're going to talk about how to track down where those evidence of threat weights are in your life, how you can offload some of those from your scale, how you can cultivate evidence of security, and further how if there has been these changes, these neuroplastic changes take place in your brain to cause your brain to become really expert at perceiving pain, to cause your orchestra to have forgotten some of the tunes other than the pain tune, we're also going to talk about how to address that problem as well. So stay tuned for more videos on those topics.